Some of these VHS tapes have damage, and they have been converted to DVD by Bill Tate, Meadowood Studios, Lenoir, North Carolina, in 2017.
To the Catawba River to check on the work. And Sunrise in Caldwell was the headline of the story, and this is some of the facts that are in it. Last Wednesday morning, a party consisting of Messrs. G.W.F. Harper, R.R. Wakefield, W.H. Cloyd, R.G. Courtney, J.R. Whidbey, Harper Bell, W.W. Scott, and Drs. A.A. Scroggs and R.L. Bell left Lenoir early on horseback for the railroad bridge across the Catawba River, over which the C&L Railroad is to cross to Lenoir. And on the way, we met with Mr. Joseph T. Powell and Will Powell, also going to welcome the narrow gauge into Caldwell County. We arrived at Mr. Mull's about 2 miles from the bridge at 12 o'clock, and after stabling our horses, proceeded on foot. At the Mull Trestle, which is one of the largest on the road, we found Mr. Azer Shell and a force of hands at work upon the heavy timbers which are designed for the trestle. And the trestle will be 37 feet high and 300 feet long. As some of the timbers are too long to be sawed, Mr. Shell is having them hewed. The company has a force of hands at work leveling the grade from the Mull's trestle to the bridge, a distance of about 1.5 miles, and has it nearly ready for track laying. The bridge is complete and is being finished off and painted. The 4 massive stone pillars upon which it rests were built by the Caldwell Construction Company with convict labor at a cost of almost $5,000. They are 30 feet high and are splendid specimens of masonry. And the granite was taken from a quarry located about 1/4 mile across the bridge. And the supervision of the bridge was by Mr. James P. Russo, a Wilkes County man. And that also mentions a little bit later on that Mr. H.N. Gwynn joined our party at the bridge. Major Harper secured a private flat car and an engine for our exclusive benefit for an excursion into Hickory. And we went over the track, which is somewhat uneven, owing to the frozen condition of the bed when it was laid, and not nearly as bad as we had expected to find it. And in good time, we were in Hickory in a few minutes. And the distance from the bridge to Hickory is about 5 miles. Sounds like, David, that they had a good trip on their private flat car into Hickory.
It sounds like, but I wonder if we could build a trestle for $5,000 today.
You want to try?
Yeah, we can see how far we can probably get one timber laid.
Right.
But John, in that very same edition, there was another story with the headline, First Railroad Train in Caldwell. And it told about the crossing of the first locomotive and the 3 loaded cars on the previous Thursday. And now reading from that article, it said, on last Thursday, the track having been laid and spiked down across the Catawba Railroad Bridge, a train of 3 loaded cars and a locomotive was brought across into Caldwell County. Upon this train were Mr. James Mason, superintendent of the C&L Railroad, Major Waddell, construction master, and Major G.W.F. Harper of Lenoir, one of the stockholders and directors who had worked in season and out of season for the completion and for this road, and Mr. J.P. Russo, superintendent of the bridge building. This is the first time in the history of the world that the Iron Horse has invaded the sacred soil of Caldwell County and dared to disturb the echoes in our everlasting hills by his discordant scream. Now, John, I think I'm back in perhaps my early literature days in school, perhaps reading a Latin story. Now that the Rubicon is crossed, old Iron Horse, make haste to proceed hitherward and scare us again with your shrill and unearthly whistle.
They knew their Latin.
Now, reading on in the story, track laying at once progressed on this side of the bridge, and it was understood that trains would run to Mull Trestle 2 miles into Caldwell on Saturday evening. If the trestle builders can keep ahead of the construction hands, Major Waddell says he will reach Lenoir by March 21st. And we certainly hope that those construction workers stayed ahead.
David, we've been talking about the C&L, and perhaps there might be some of our listeners that don't know that that is the Chester and Lenoir. It's the railroad that started in Chester, South Carolina, and came to Lenoir. Later on, the railroad changed to the C&NW, which is Carolina and Northwestern. However, a lot of the local wags sometimes call that the can't and never will.
The C and the W.
That's right. When it seemed like there was going to be a little bit of delay getting it here, that became the name that was used for it. It did take a few more months before the railroad came to Lenoir, and there was great excitement in other communities along the way as they anticipated the arrival of the railroad. And the topic had some good news for the village of Hudsonville, which is now the town of Hudson, on February 20, 1884, when it reported, "The railroad authorities have promised to establish a depot at Hudsonville if the citizens will do the building, and they are going to do it. Town lots are being laid off, and a Raleigh man has built a summer residence there."
And John, the Lenoir News on May 21st, 1884 reported with the headline, "The Railroad Celebration," that a Jubilee was being planned for June the 5th to mark the completion of the Chester and Lenoir Railroad in Lenoir. Now, from that, we do have that article. Well, reading from that article that was headlined "The Railroad Celebration," the committee has decided upon the 5th of June as the date of the Jubilee in Lenoir over the completion of the Chester and Lenoir Railroad to Lenoir. The celebration will consist of speeches, driving the last spike, procession, address of welcome, etc. The exact program of which will be soon published by the Committee of Arrangements. It's probable that several thousand people will be here on that day. One brass band has been employed, and it would add much to the celebration if two could be secured. But the expense of the whole affair has been thus far cast upon the shoulders of the town. Now that sounds very familiar, John.
It does, right.
This is a county road, and we feel sure that our friends in the country will be glad to contribute toward the celebration. Let a subscription be taken up during court week for the purpose of defraying the expenses of another band. Sound like a good idea to me.
Right.
We again refer to the suggestion thrown out some weeks ago that it would be a splendid idea for everybody to come with baskets full of provisions, and that we hold the biggest picnic that ever was known in Caldwell County.
Sounds like a good idea to me, David.
Once again, a great idea, but all of that over a railroad.
Right.
John, I was just talking about, in that last article I read, about the greatest celebration that had been here, and it's, of course, difficult for us to imagine that they would be that excited over the arrival of the railroad. But I do have another article here that talks about that. It's a very long article. I perhaps will read some of it, or perhaps all of it, but this is from the June 4th, 1884 Lenoir topic, and it says, "The Chester and Lenoir Road is finished. Do we realize it fully, and can we actually believe it to be true, even with such evidence before us as regular trains running up and down since last Monday?" We published on the first page a brief history of the work from its inception up to the present consummation, hurriedly compiled by an esteemed friend of the topic. Gotten up in haste, it does not pretend to be a full and complete delineation of all the phases of this great work, so important to Caldwell and the mountain country. To do that should show how hope deferred, which maketh the heart sick, has not been able to appall the stout hearts that pushed bravely on over all obstacles, clamoring, demanding work in and out of season, having but one object in view, the completion of the road to Lenoir. Now, John, they were excited.
I believe so.
They were excited. They thought this was the greatest thing that had ever happened, and perhaps in 1884 it was.
Right, and they even came through some adverse circumstances, it seems.
It seems. Now, reading on, it says, "In spite of open enemies, in spite of hidden foes, dragging despondent friends along with them, they never did completely lose hope. The completion of this road is a victory won by perseverance and should be a bright example for the encouragement of all other roads begun under unfavorable episodes. So this article goes on and on for quite some time, but it just goes on to, again, in the article it talks about it being completed to Hudsonville, as we all know as the town of Hudson these days. But,
and David, our friends at Hudson are going to be having a celebration for their town in 2005, and I hope they'll include some of this in their celebration.
Yes, and perhaps they will, because they've been spoken of prominently in
Right.
these articles here.
Right.
And it was an accomplishment that railroad did get to Hudsonville.
Right. There's an interesting story on December 20th, 1899 that had nothing to do with the arrival of the railroad in Lenoir, but reflects the growing pains of the Carolina Northwestern Railroad. And several prominent Lenoir names are mentioned. Last Friday, the Carolina Northwestern Railroad passed into new hands. On that day, the stockholders met at Gastonia and accepted the resignation of the old board of directors, and a new board was elected, and the names of the people are given, and I do not recognize them as being any Caldwell County people there. Major G.W.F. Harper did submit his resignation, and it was accepted and made a part of the minutes of the meeting. And then a resolution was passed that the stockholders hereby express their appreciation of the valuable service of Major Harper as president of the company. Excellent and efficient manner in which he has administered the affairs of the road for the past 6 years deserves our highest commendation.
Those early trains are what was known as narrow gauge. Railroads for narrow gauge trains were only 3 feet apart, and those for a standard gauge train are 4 feet 8.5 inches. So you can imagine a narrow gauge being only 36 inches,
Right.
a standard gauge being 4 feet 8.5 inches.
Right.
So
A little over
standard
4.5
gauge
feet.
is 20-some inches wider than than a narrow gauge. So there probably was a certain amount of prestige for a community to have a standard gauge line rather than a narrow gauge.
Probably so.
Yeah. However, people who know about such things tell us that a narrow gauge actually had some advantages, especially in the steep mountainous country that we have around here. The road beds took up obviously less space.
Right.
The trains could negotiate tighter curves, steeper grades, and there was a substantial difference in building a narrow gauge line compared to a standard gauge, since the cross ties were much shorter. The Chester and Lenoir Railroad, which was the first to come to Caldwell County, ultimately extended its tracks all the way to Collinsville, Mortimer, where Ritter Lumber Company cut millions of board feet of lumber in the early 1900s, and then on to Edgemont. Even after the standard gauge arrived in 1902, the railroad around Mortimer had 3 rails, 2 of them wider for the standard gauge train, and then the 3rd rail for those narrow gauge. And then Ritter, of course, had all those narrow gauge trains up there for those very reasons, that it was steep and mountainous and curvy. Now, of course, there would have been logistical problems of transferring a load of freight from a narrow gauge boxcar to a standard gauge car, so it was inevitable that the change to standard gauge would become necessary.
Well, it became necessary in Lenoir in the early 1900s, and this issue of the newspaper from July 16, 1902 talks about the broadening of the C&NW and the anticipated arrival of the standard gauge trains within a month. And it reads, the broadening of the C&NW to Lenoir means much for the place, and since the construction is so nearly finished, standard gauge trains will be in Lenoir within a month. We should begin to work to the end that we may thoroughly appreciate the benefit of the new system and advertise ourselves to the people of this and other states as being no longer isolated by a narrow gauge railroad from the great highways of commerce. Seems like, David, they had an eye toward the outside world at the time.
Yes.
And it also seems that this generation of people wanted a celebration too, because they asked, would it not be advisable to arrange for a great celebration when the work of broadening shall be finished? Close up shop and let everyone take a day off. A great crowd, sounds good to me, doesn't it, you?
Yes.
A great crowd could be brought to town and much benefit derived from the advertisement thus gained. We commend this idea to the businessmen of the town and trust that they will take steps to make this event a certainty. At the proper time, we suppose the mayor will call a meeting and arrange for having a day in Lenoir. Speak of this matter and see what we fittingly recognize as the benefits to be derived from a standard gauge in Lenoir. You know, David, I don't think we had a Chamber of Commerce at that time, so I guess it did depend on each of the individual businessmen if they wanted to do that.
Yeah, so they did have to, they had to look out for themselves, certainly.
Right.
Now, following up on that, John, a broad gauge train was the headline on August 13th, 1902. One locomotive had been sent to Lenoir earlier to test the track, and then on the preceding Monday evening, the first train arrived. Now, from that article, it says, the long expected came at last, and the fevers, anxieties, and doubts of the past were forgotten in the transient glory of the now, and everyone in town partook of the novelty of the occasion. The broad gauge had come at last. The heart of the small boy bounded, and the pulse of this same boy's father beat quicker as the town and its interests became appreciated. The old day of isolation was over, and the town became fully in touch with the great outer world. So finally, I guess this is the moment in time that we came in touch with the great outer world. The first train came in Monday night, but this had been preceded by one engine which was run to Lenoir to try the track. Well, I would have hated to have been on that test train, I guess.
I don't know, there might have been a sense of adventure about it.
Probably, yeah, probably so, yeah. It says a large force had worked the day before, and everything was in fair running condition. We are proud of our town and in its growth, and we look confidently for a brighter, broader future of our town. We congratulate the C&N.W. and our town upon the advent of a new era of material progress.
And David, just 2 days later, there was another story in the paper about the arrival of the broad gauge train. An event in the history of Lenoir was the coming of the standard gauge train last Monday. The pilot train, consisting of a 75-ton 10-wheel engine pushing 5 loaded freight cars and an 80,000-pound coal car, was the first to try the road and arrived at 6:15 p.m. It came over safely, taking every precaution and filling the way carefully. People had been gathered about the station and along the line from noon, expectantly waiting the train, and when it came, a deafening cheer went up from the throng. The engine returned to Hickory once and brought in the regular passenger train, consisting of mail and baggage cars and 2 coaches. This arrived about 11:30 p.m. and was greeted by a larger crowd, perhaps than the day train. Passengers coming in were pleased with the cars and the time made. So apparently it was a late evening celebration, David. These people apparently stayed up late to see both trains come in.
Yes. And John, I have to go back to an article I was reading a few moments ago, and certainly not to make light of a bad incident, but when we were reading about the train coming to Caldwell County, the news topic had a little note under news notes that said last Wednesday a railroad train ran over Sheriff Fields of Lenoir County and killed him. So I don't know if the train came to Lenoir County for the first time and they were out celebrating that, or I don't know what he was doing on the railroad tracks, but I thought it very interesting that here the news topic was having all these articles about the celebration and the big event. The train was coming now into Caldwell County, and on the same page they talk about the sheriff of Lenoir County being
coming into the town of Lenoir, and Lenoir County has a tragedy as a result of it.
But now, 5 days later from the article you were reading on August the 20th, 1902, there was a story about how enthusiastic everyone was about the announcement that a big celebration was being planned. And it reads, "Everybody in the town of Lenoir is thoroughly enthused over the broad gauge and industrial celebration for September 18th. The following may be definitely announced. Dr. Kent has granted the use of his grounds in the rear of the college where abundance of shade, room, and water are to be obtained." Now, John, Dr. Kent, talking about the rear of the college, where is he talking about?
I suspect, David, that that's behind Davenport School now, maybe where Kentwood is, probably in the section where Walker Stadium and right behind the Heritage Museum and that general section.
Okay. Now, the article went on to say that access to the grounds will be easy as a new street has been ordered laid out to the grounds. So they were going to build a new street.
Even a new street,
right. Just to accommodate this. Nearly every merchant and manufacturer in town will have a float representative of his business. Speakers are being corresponded with and their names will be announced next week. Good music will be had by at least 2 bands. The procession will form near the depot upon arrival of excursion trains from the south and will march through town to the grounds where refreshments for the tired and amusement for the weary can be obtained. A tournament baseball game and a tug of war participated in by men from various townships will be had. Sounds like a battle of the towns to me.
Right.
And other interesting features to be announced later. Dinner will be had on grounds and everything necessary for the comfort and amusement of the people will be provided. The biggest day Lenoir has ever seen and no one should fail to come. The railroad rates will be 1 fare for round trip. Other announcements later, but this to be assured that the greatest time is promised to our people ever known of in this section and prepare now to celebrate the occasion in due form." Now, it seems like every time we read one of these articles, it's going to be the greatest celebration that has ever been seen.
Okay, but let me read you a little bit about the actual celebration that was in the newspaper on September 24th under the title, "The Great 18th." I want you to listen to the names of the individuals and the businesses that were part.
Right.
They said the weather was ideal. You can't ask for more than that. The crowds gathered such as were never before seen in Lenoir, and the streets of a quiet town were becoming the tramping grounds of a multitude. So they must have had a few people there, David. Okay, here's the actual celebration itself. About 10 o'clock, the procession began to form, and by 11 began to march through the town, headed by the marshals and the Lenoir Concert Band. The floats in the following order: the Bank of Lenoir, a large safe surrounded by 4 young soldiers, Masters Ed Cloyd, Jeff Courtney, Lee Nelson, and James Harper, armed with muskets of the antebellum type, representing the safety of this financial institution. Then Triplet Brothers, an omnibus laden with pretty girls. Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
The Lenoir Mills, a mammoth bag filled with the product of this mill. Bernhardt Hardware and Furniture Company, a large float displaying the vehicles sold by this concern, and another creation of white displaying house furnishing goods and hardware. Then Poe and Tuttle had a display of their stairwork, mantels, and doors. Theodore P. Kincaid and Company then followed with an appropriate float. The Builders Supply Company, an elegant house done in miniature. Cloyd and Johnson's float, representing their general merchandise and produce business, was next in the order, followed by that of the Lenoir Cotton Mills, which was elegantly made, bearing the lady operatives of the mills. Lenoir Electric Company followed, representing the local telephone exchange. Palmer and Watson followed with their float, representing their lines of general merchandise, and then Mr. J.A. Dula with a float displaying the celebrated Dula Beauty Apples. Mm-hmm. The float of J.E. Shell and Company, druggist, was next in order, showing us as well as could be their lines of drugs. Then came the bicycle rider, bearing the banner of A.W. Dula, jeweler and optician. Then the Hinkle Livestock Company came with the most pretentious and beautiful display, led by a pony carriage driven by Miss Christine Hinkle, who was, as the ladies say, an awfully sweet and cute. Then came a stagecoach drawn by 6 horses, bearing such passengers as one would delight in accompanying, and this followed by a wagon exhibiting their stock of harnesses, lap robes, etc. Then the RFD carriers came in a carriage decorated with Uncle Sam's emblems. The prize winner next followed that of J.A. Woodruff, bearing samples of groceries and a large basket which was occupied by the following riders: Mrs. Jones, Pike, Atkinson, Latta, Bell, and Wright. Then came the float of the news, followed by those of H.T. Newland, J.L. Nelson, and M.M. Courtney, each representing a general merchandise business. Moretz and Company and Hairston and Company next followed with a display of fancy groceries. Conley's Mill representing the products of that mill. J.M. Bernhardt, a large wagon laden with lumber boxes and drawn by 4 large steers. The Wilson Lumber and Milling Company, a car loaded with lumber and boxes, and the procession passed. Then after that, David, they went to the celebration grounds, and Captain Jones delivered an address of welcome, after which the crowd dispersed to satisfy the longings of the inner man. Then after dinner, Mr. D.A. Tompkins delivered an address that was published somewhere else in the paper, and so it seems like they had a full day of celebration.
They did, and they really knew how to celebrate, obviously, back in those days.
Right. You mentioned the races and things a few minutes ago. Mr. Calvin Spencer won the bag race after an exciting contest, and Jay Bumgarner the wheelbarrow race. And the tug of war was won by Lenoir over Lower Creek and by Patterson over Yadkin Valley.
Uh-oh. So did the 2 winners? I wonder if Lenoir and Patterson had a tug of war.
I don't know. They didn't give us that
So
information.
Lenoir beat Lower Creek, and then Patterson beat
Yadkin
Valley, but Lenoir and Patterson didn't tug against one another.
Well, we don't know whether they did or not. If they did, they
don't
didn't
know.
tell us. You know, David, one of the things that always amazes me when I read these old newspaper items is the flowery language and the style of language. And as a former English teacher, I am interested in words. For example, you would never think of a float as being described as elegantly made, or the lady operatives of the mills. I guess that's the ladies who operated the machines. Christine Hinkle described as awful sweet and cute. Would we say something like that today?
No, we couldn't get away with that these days.
Probably not, huh? And a daintily decorated vehicle.
Yes.
Of course, I don't know what age Christine Hinkle was. If she were a little girl, we might could describe her as sweet and cute in a daintily decorated vehicle and get by with it. But the language is an experience in itself.
It is, John, and I know in the position that you have with the museum, I've been interested in genealogy for probably close to 30 years now, and one of the things that really interests me, and I can say this about myself because I'm talking about my own ancestors, but when I look at the census, especially during that 1880 through early 1900 period, which these articles have been about, during that period of time, as I trace my ancestry, when I look at those census, my ancestors were always marked on that census form as not being able to read or write. So I sit here in amazement that there's these kinds of articles during that period of time that my ancestors didn't know about. They could not have read these articles and know about what was going on. What kind of audience was the news topic after during that time?
I don't know the reading level of their audience. As we probably need to remember, Davenport College was here, and that was a mecca of culture for the town of Lenoir. However, I can't believe that that was the only audience for the newspaper.
Yeah.
But obviously these people who did the writing were very well educated people themselves. And certainly their use of the language is an art in itself.
Yeah, and it is very, very flowery, very, I don't know, Shakespearean, Elizabethan, I don't know.
And let's face it, it's much more interesting reading than the terse sentences we find in news reporting today.
Today, it certainly is, yes. But of course, more of us are able to well, now that brings up another interesting subject. More of us now can read and write, but look what we're reading and writing. So maybe this does point out a shortcoming.
Well, this is the Victorian period too, when writers like Dickens and the Bronte sisters and so forth felt like the more words you could use to say something, the better. They say that Dickens was paid by the word, so therefore he wrote as many words as he could. But that was the Victorian style of writing, and today our trend is to say it in fewer words instead of more words.
Yeah. But anyway, perhaps we'll come back and do another story on reading and writing and arithmetic one day.
That would be interesting.
It was. If I try to find out how or why they wrote back the way they did. But just summarizing, though, all these articles that we've read, obviously the train coming here was a cause for great celebration. And reading the articles, they certainly did celebrate.
Right.
But I don't know what we could sit here today and compare that to, John. I don't know what would bring this town, bring this entire county out in those kinds of numbers to celebrate. Perhaps Lenoir or somewhere in Caldwell County, an airport was built where jumbo jets, B-52s could land. I don't know if that would be an occasion to celebrate like they did the coming of the train, but coming out of the period of time that we're talking about here, the fact that a train came, and as one of the articles said, we finally were hooked up to the rest of the world.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It just seems that they placed a lot of importance on that train coming.
Right.
And then the townspeople, the business people, wanted to be sure that everybody realized that, and they did so by having these celebrations.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, also, they couldn't sit at home and watch it on television in those days. If they wanted to be a part of it, they had to get out there and
they had to come and witness.
Right.
That's true also. And these newspapers back in those days obviously didn't print pictures. I don't recall seeing any pictures in these newspapers.
At one time, I did a study to see when the first picture appeared in the newspaper, but I've forgotten. I think it was in the teens, maybe even the 20s, when the first picture appeared in our local paper.
Advertisements, but that's printed material. But well, anyway, John, the train came, the train left. But when it came, it certainly was a period of time that was cause for great celebration. A very important time in the development of Caldwell County.
Absolutely. It opened Caldwell County as an industrial center and as well as a place for tourists to come to ride the train, go to Blowing Rock.
Well, John, I've enjoyed looking and reading. Perhaps a lot of our viewers didn't enjoy me reading that well, but I do think it's very interesting, and I do appreciate the time that you've been able to come and spend with me as we look back at this day in history.
Please support our Caldwell Heritage Museum, 112 Vaden Street, Lenoir, North Carolina, and please visit and support Lenoir and Caldwell County History on Facebook. Thank you.